Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this talk by John Sides. My name is Peter Loewen. I'm a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And together with colleagues, I have the real pleasure of hosting this series on the 2020 US election. We're lucky to have no one better than we could have today, John Sides, to explain to us what happened 2 Tuesdays past. John will be known to many of you. He gave a talk at U of T, really helping us understand the 2016 and 2018 elections in December of 2018. We're really pleased to have him back virtually, if not in person. John's a professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, previously at George Washington and the University of Texas at Austin, author of several great books on American elections, most recently Identity Crisis, and before that, The Gamble. And he's the editor of The Monkey Cage. And if you don't know what The Monkey Cage is, it's a blog, effectively, or a site on the Washington Post, in the Washington Post suite. And it really is the best place to get, I think, detailed, data-rich, academically grounded, but publicly accessible insights into politics around the world. So in a time when discourse is really coarsening and it's getting less smart, the monkey stage stands astride against that. So it's really our pleasure to have John here. Before I turn it over to him, I do want to acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Toronto operates. This has for thousands of years been the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And it's our pleasure to work and live on this land today, which is still the home to people from across Turtle Island. John, I'm going to turn it over to you. I understand you've got some slides. Before I turn it over to you officially, I just want to say welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. And thanks for sharing with us your time and your insights on what happened and what's happening and what might happen in American politics. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And it's a real pleasure to be joining all of you virtually. I'm sorry, I wish I could be there in person again. So whenever I get asked to give talks about the election within like 2 weeks of the election, it's a significant challenge because there's a lot that we don't know. And at best, we can offer speculation on a ton of interesting questions, which maybe we'll get into a little later on. But I want to focus my comments today on some of the basics that help us, I think, understand the outcome, put the outcome in context, calibrate our sort of expectations and reaction. And I want to do that by focusing on a set of things that we sometimes call the election fundamentals. And so to start off by explaining the election, I want to give you one initial takeaway. The takeaway is that the fundamentals predicted the actual outcome, which is that Trump would lose, and he has lost. But unlike, I think, the national and state polling, the fundamentals didn't really predict a Biden landslide. And so if we were paying attention to the fundamentals during the campaign, I think it would have tempered expectations, especially among Democrats, about what Biden would be able to achieve. And that would have put us, in some sense, in a more realistic posture heading into election night and the days afterward. So in thinking about election fundamentals, I want to walk you through a handful of factors that fall in that category. One of the first is the existence of an incumbency advantage for presidents running for re-election, combined with what we can call tenure, which is the number of terms that the president's party has controlled the White House consecutively. So a longer tenured party will be in the White House for more years on end. So to give you an example, from 1980 until 1992, the Republican Party controlled the White House. That's a fairly long tenure in the modern era of American politics. So incumbency and tenure should be working actually to Trump's advantage. So one of the reasons is that it's unusual to defeat an incumbent president. So I gave you some statistics here. These are basically the outcomes of every presidential election from 1792 to 2016, with the exception of 1824, where there really wasn't any party competition, just competition within one party. So you can see that when the incumbent is running for re-election, they tend to win 2/3 of the time, 22 wins and 11 losses. When the incumbent is not running, how does the incumbent party fare? Well, they're slightly more likely to lose than they are to win. And so, for example, 2016 falls into that losing category. The Democrats lost when the incumbent was not running for re-election. So on just walking in and not knowing anything else, not even knowing who the occupant of the White House is, knowing that that person is running for re-election would suggest that they should have some advantage. And what's even more interesting is when we take those 11 cases where the incumbent party loses. And in only 4 cases did that loss happen after the White House had held the party for only 1 term. Usually when the incumbent party loses, it's in part because they've been in the office, they've controlled the White House for a longer period of time. So to go back to the example from before, when George H.W. Bush loses in 1992, he is losing after, his party has controlled the White House for 12 years. Trump's losing after only controlling it for 4 years. If we're interested in the period of time after the 22nd Amendment limited the number of terms the president could serve, there really is only one other president who ended up in the circumstance that Trump ended up in, and that was Jimmy Carter in 1980, losing after 1 term and after the Democratic Party had controlled the White House for only that 1 term. So I think this, again, got a lot lost on election night when the initial returns were disappointing for many Democrats. But what Biden pulled off was something that's quite unusual relative to what we typically see, historically speaking, across the entire history of American presidential elections. So then we get to a second factor. And of course, that's the economy. We've known for a long time that the economy plays some role in whether or not incumbent presidents and incumbent parties are returned to the White House. Good economies, economic growth tends to help incumbents and incumbent parties. Bad economies, economic contraction, recession tends to hurt the parties who are in the White House. So what we are dealing with, though, amidst the COVID-19 pandemic is what I call a politically ambiguous economy. And of course, the important word there is politically ambiguous. For many people, it's not ambiguous. It's pretty bad, but it's politically ambiguous. And the easiest way to see that is to look historically at a set of economic statistics and try to put this election year in that context. And that's when it gets messy and therefore somewhat ambiguous. So let me show you 3 different things. Here is a measure of the size of the economy, gross domestic product, measured as the quarter-over-quarter change. So from one quarter to the next, how much does gross domestic product grow, which would mean the economy is expanding, and how much does it shrink? And so you can see historically since the late 1940s, we have typically experienced growth rates, somewhere between 1, 2, occasionally 3 or 4%. When we have had economic recessions, we've seen quarter-over-quarter growth decline by 1 to 2%. And when we get to the 2020, though, we see measurements that we've never seen. There's a small decline initially, 1.3%, and then, of course, the bottom drops out as so much of the country's economy has to shut down to try to mitigate COVID infections. And so we saw just in that 1 quarter, a 9 percentage point drop in the size of gross domestic product. But then, right, as the country, quote unquote, reopened and some economic activity resumed, then again, on a quarter by quarter basis, growth increased sharply by an amount we've never seen before. So on the one hand, we are in a recession by most any definition, but we are experiencing sort of uncharacteristically wild swings in economic growth in a very short time. And what does that net out for in terms of politics? Well, it's not totally clear. On balance, we haven't gotten back to where we were before the pandemic, but we are certainly on a positive trajectory, although perhaps one that's starting to slow down. You can look at unemployment and see a similar thing. Historically, when we've had periods of economic contraction and recession, we've seen unemployment spike to numbers like 8%, 10%. But now in April of this year, unemployment in the United States spiked to almost 15%. But again, it corrected quite quickly, such that by October, it was sitting at 7%. Now, it may be that that 7% figure is in other ways understating the extent to which people's employment status is tenuous, or the extent to which they've been able to, in some sense, recover the job that they had prior to the pandemic. But nevertheless, like as with gross domestic product, things got really terrible. They got somewhat better, but not back to where they were prior to the pandemic. So how should we interpret that? What does that mean economically? Now let's complicate things even further. Another measure of people's economic well-being is their income. And this has been a statistic that political scientists have looked at and used to try to understand elections for a long time. What happens in 2020 is a historic increase in people's disposable incomes. So this is the trend again over time. Incomes have been generally getting larger in constant dollars throughout the last 60 years. But what happens in the spring of 2020 is a nearly $5,000 increase in people's disposable incomes per capita. That is largely because of government transfers, stimulus packages, and et cetera, that is meant to offset the effects of the pandemic and the recession. When the government calculates real disposable income, it treats that as income alongside people's income from jobs and other private activity. So again, how should we interpret that? Is that suggest, in fact, that people's economic conditions are maybe better than we would think if we just looked at unemployment or GDP? Or does that $5,000 or so increase really count, given that it's coming from the government and it's really not actually money that people have earned or can count on for any longer term? You can actually already see, if you squint really hard there at the right-hand side of that, you can see that number dropping in the quarter after it hit $50,000, which is because, right, some of this money really is just temporary, and the government hasn't been able to pass a second stimulus plan that would give people, another cash outflow or inflow that would help them, make ends meet as the recession continues. So one way to sort of see what this adds up to and the ambiguity it creates is to actually ask people how the economy is doing. And there is a long-standing measure called the Index of Consumer Sentiment that has been part of national surveys since the 1950s. And the Index of Consumer Sentiment is built on 5 questions that ask you both how your personal financial circumstances have changed recently, have they gotten better or worse, and then also what you think they're going to do in the future. You get a similar set of questions about people, the business conditions in the country as a whole, outside of your own personal circumstances. How are they doing relative to where they've been, and where do you think they're going? And when you scale those questions together, you get a measure where higher values indicate more favorable views of the economy. And this is what that trend looks like over the history of the measure. So the y-axis is that index, and it's not on the percentage point scale, so it has values that can be higher than 100. These numbers don't mean anything in absolute terms, but I think the important thing is to think about the relative shifts. And what I'm showing you here with the little segments that are colored orange are the periods of time where the country entered a recession, and that just shows you that in those time periods, consumer sentiment tends to drop. And you can see it then recover and increase as the economy recovers from the recession. I'm also highlighting to you here the reading from October of each presidential year. That's what the white dots signify. So go all the way to the end, where we get to the period of time in this election year. And you can see a very sharp drop in in consumer sentiment, which is consistent with the economic recession. And then you'll see it recover a little bit toward the end, which again is consistent with the small sort of shift that we've had back toward something approximating the pre-pandemic economy. Now, look at that in absolute terms too. Where is that dot relative to other dots? Well, you'll see that in 2020, as of October, consumer sentiment is much more favorable than it was, let's say, in 2008, when the country was in the middle of the Great Recession. It is also roughly equivalent to what it was in 2012, when Obama was reelected as an incumbent president fairly comfortably. So here we are in a recession, but at the same time, the objective economic indicators are fluctuating wildly in ways that we have no sort of clear historical precedent for. People's views of the economy are clearly worse than they were prior to the recession, but neither are they as worse as they have been. And they're maybe not as bad as they need to be in order for an incumbent president to lose. So this is what I mean by politically ambiguous at the end of the day. Okay, what comes next? Presidential approval is the other fundamental. Whenever a presidential election is held, but especially when the president himself is running for re-election, of course, the public's sense of how they've handled the job is important. And this is where we get to one of the more interesting things about Donald Trump's presidency. There's not much evidence that the good economy we experienced prior to the pandemic or the recession we've experienced during the pandemic hurt him politically in terms of his approval rating, at least. Nor does the pandemic more generally appear to hurt his approval rating. His approval is remarkably stable, as I'll show you. But the challenge for Trump is that he was already chronically unpopular. His problems predate the economy and the pandemic. And in some sense, the economy and the pandemic didn't help make him any more popular, and that's the problem that he was confronting going into election day. So let me show you some data that speaks to this. So the first question is, how does consumer sentiment, people's views of the economy, how do they correlate with presidential approval? It should be the case that the more people evaluate the economy positively, the more they evaluate the president positively. They give the president credit for a good economy, regardless of whether they deserve it or not. Same thing when the economy contracts. But nevertheless, that's the typical way in which the economy affects presidential approval. That's increasingly not the case. So here's a plot. So go to this is a very graph-heavy talk, of course, because that's all we can do here in social science. If you look at the horizontal axis, you'll see the index of consumer sentiment. It's the same thing I showed you before. If you look at the vertical axis, it's the percent who approves of the job the president is doing. And I put up a dot here for every month in which we have a measure of consumer sentiment and a measure of presidential approval. This dates back to the Kennedy administration. Now, the gray dots are all the presidents, all the months for all the presidents who were in office between Kennedy and George W. Bush. And I put a gray line there, which shows you that on average, as consumer sentiment goes up, so does presidential approval. Other things affect presidential approval: wars, terrorist attacks, scandals. But nevertheless, on average, presidents are more popular when people think the economy is doing well and less popular when people think it's not doing well. Then we get to the Obama presidency. And you can see the blue dots and the blue line suggests no positive relationship at all, and maybe even a slightly negative relationship. What happens under Obama is that consumer sentiment increases almost continuously throughout his presidency as the country recovers from the Great Recession. But Obama's approval rating never really responds to that. In fact, Obama's approval rating is higher when he first steps into office amidst the Great Recession than it is at the end of his presidency when he's presided over all of this economic growth. Then you get to Trump. Same thing. When the economy was doing very well and consumer sentiment was high, Trump was, first of all, much less popular than any previous president was in a similar situation. So the orange dots are lower than the blue dots, lower than the gray dots. And when the economy tanks during the recession, Trump's approval barely moves. It doesn't drop at all. So the line's flat. The orange line, the blue line, these are flat. Trump is not suffering because of the pandemic economy. But as you can see, Trump is historically unpopular, no matter how well the economy is doing or how poorly it's doing. This is driven home when you look at the trend in Trump's approval and you compare it to previous presidents. So here we go. What I've done here is I've taken the percentage of Americans who approve of the job the president's doing and subtracted the percentage who disapprove. So negative numbers mean that more people disapprove than approve. You're underwater, politically speaking. And I've put Trump against all of the other elected incumbent presidents in their first term in office. So if you go from the upper left, you'll see Trump against Obama, and then Trump against George W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton, and then the first President Bush, Reagan, Carter, Nixon, and Eisenhower. And what you see are two things. One is that Trump's approval rating is in almost every month of office lower than any of these prior presidents, with the exception of presidents like Carter and Bush at the very end of their time in office or in the midst of economic or other kinds of crises. So Trump is just historically and chronically unpopular, and that is true in the very first month of his time in office. You know, you can compare Trump to Obama, let's say at the beginning of their term, and see how true that is. Obama's net approval rating is about 40, plus 40, and Trump's is, you know, almost minus 10. And you can also see the extraordinary stability of Trump's approval. It's bounced around a little bit, but much, much less than previous presidents have experienced. So Trump starts his presidency as a fairly unpopular president, and that has not really changed. So even if we can't sort of identify a clear effect of the economy or the pandemic on Trump's approval rating, we can certainly say that nothing about what's happened in this election year seemed to improve his approval rating very much. And so he's going into the election with this handicap as an incumbent president. So incumbency and tenure, the economy, presidential approval. Let's try to put these things together and understand what they might imply for what we should have expected to how this election would turn out. So how well did the fundamentals forecast is the question. So we can take the presidential elections between 1948 and 2016 and construct simple statistical models that would produce an estimate of how Trump should do in 2020, given conditions in this election year, the economy and presidential approval. There's nothing magical about these models. There's a lot of simplifying assumptions that go into them, but I think of them helpful just as a basic exercise in calibrating how the incumbent or how the president actually did. So one of the ways to do this is to say, okay, the most basic measure of the economy is the gross domestic product. Let's take change in the gross domestic product over the first 6 months of the election year. So we're not going to take any one quarter, but we're going to look at the first 6 months. And if you go back to that graph, what we're thinking about now is that change where gross domestic product drops significantly, but then recovers, but not to where it was. So the change in gross domestic product over this entire time period is negative, right? But it's not as negative as that one dramatic quarter suggests. Trump's approval rating in June is 40%. Nothing magical about June, but for forecasting, it's always nice to go back a little bit in time and then see how well you can forecast several months ahead. So Trump's approval rating in June. And we can make sure that those factors are combined with whether the incumbent's running, because we would expect the economy and presidential approval to matter more when the incumbent himself is actually on the ballot relative to a year where he's not on the ballot. So we're allowing the effect of those two things, economy and presidential approval, to vary depending on whether the incumbent's running. Okay, so if you knew nothing about 2020, but you just plugged in 2020 numbers into that simple model, what you would get is that Trump should win 46% of the major party vote, that is to say, 46% of the votes for the Democratic and Republican candidates for president. All right, let's do a second one. Now let's take the same change in gross domestic product over the first half of the election year, take that June approval rating, and then let's add a measure of tenure. Tenure in this case is a simple thing. Either your party's controlled the White House for one consecutive term, as it was the case this year, or it's controlled the White House for more than one consecutive term, as it was, let's say, in 1992. So that's a simple measure. Typically, presidents do better when their party has controlled the White House for only one term. The more terms their party has controlled the White House, the worse they tend to do. That's the historical pattern in post-war elections. So that would predict Trump's share of the major party vote is about 47%. So I don't know how closely you guys are following the ongoing vote count in the United States, but I checked it this morning, and I took all the votes for Trump and all the votes for Biden that have been recorded thus far, and I calculated Trump's share of those votes, and guess what it is? It's 48%. And it's probably going to drop a little bit more as votes are counted, because many of those votes are coming from places like California and New York that lean Democratic. So it's entirely possible that at the end of the day, we're going to get a major party outcome in the 2020 presidential election that is less than 2 or even less than 1 percentage point from simple forecasts based on only a few fundamental variables that have been historically associated with presidential elections. And if you had that in your mind, if you had something like, oh, Biden might beat Trump by, I don't know, 5 percentage points in the national popular vote going into the election, and you wouldn't have been as surprised when the much larger lead that the polls implied for Biden failed to materialize. So I think the takeaway here is that despite a lot of Democratic consternation when Biden failed to win a landslide or failed to deliver an outcome that would seem like an unequivocal rebuke of the president, I think we have to put it in a different context. Biden and Kamala Harris pulled off something that is extraordinarily rare. And they did it by about the margin that we should have expected, given the politically ambiguous economy and given Trump's approval rating. So that's what I want to say just to start. As I said to Peter when we were talking earlier, this is a set of comments that are focused on only on a few big questions. And there are obviously lots of other questions and complications in this particular election that I'd be happy to talk about more, even if in a speculative fashion. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
John, thanks very much. I've got some questions, and the first question I had is really one that's actually captured in the Q&A, and I'd encourage people, if you've got questions, to add them to the Q&A box on your Zoom. But there's a question here about whether this election is kind of sufficiently unique, such that things like the pandemic, the uniqueness of Donald Trump, he is really unlike any other president, that these would make the fundamentals less relevant in this case. What's your response to that? I mean, it seems that they do work, but how do we explain that they work, given how unique Trump is and kind of the unique characteristics of this election?
Yeah. So that's a really great question, and I think there is every reason to look at the election year and be impressed by what is just unprecedented about it, particularly with the pandemic. But there are a set of background conditions that are actually implicit to some extent in some of these slides that I've showed that create, I think, a degree of stability and predictability. One of the things that's lurking that I didn't say explicitly is the increasingly strong role that partisanship appears to play, and not just how people vote in an election, but how they evaluate the president and even how they evaluate the economy itself. Part of the reason why it appears that Obama and Trump's approval ratings didn't move very much when economic circumstances changed dramatically is because, first of all, Obama's not getting much credit from Republicans for the growing economy. If you want a simple comparison, Obama's approval rating among Republicans was always hovering around 10 or 12% throughout the sweep of his presidency, including when the economy was growing. You can go back to 1984 when Ronald Reagan won re-election. And at the beginning of that year, when the economy was also recovering from a pretty bad recession, 33% of Democrats, as of January 1980, approved of the job Ronald Reagan was doing. 1/3 of Democrats approved of a Republican president. It's almost impossible to imagine that would be true today. So I think why this matters for Trump to some extent is it's putting, of course, it's putting a ceiling on his approval ratings when the economy is doing well, but it's also putting a floor under his approval ratings when the economy is doing badly. He hasn't really lost a large number of Republicans who, would disapprove of his handling of the job because of the pandemic or anything like that. So in some sense, the unprecedented stuff that happens occurs in a context in which there are these background structural conditions in American politics which are creating stability and predictability. So that may be why, even in an unprecedented year, some of these fundamental factors matter a great deal. I do think what is unusual about Trump, even compared to someone like Obama, is that chronic unpopularity. And I've looked at polls on Trump going back to the 1990s. And this is frequently the circumstance that he finds himself in, especially when he gets involved in politics, which he did in the late 1990s, and he did again in 2011, 12, and then he did again, of course, when he ran for president. Trump is typically a guy who is less popular than he is popular when he is, running for office or dabbling in politics, and then he, as a president, when he's actually, won an election, he tends to be relatively unpopular no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe, I mean, what's unprecedented about Trump is just that views of him appeared so resistant to information or changes in the political environment that otherwise would seem to have advantaged or disadvantaged previous presidents. Now, what we don't know and what we'll have to see is whether the same thing is going to be true for future presidents. And if someone like Biden, who is probably as normal a candidate and a president as Trump is an abnormal candidate and president, if the same thing is true for Biden, then we may now be getting into a different era of American politics where political opinions just don't change very much, in which case then the forecast is just what's the president's approval rating, and that'll probably get us most of the way to thinking about who's going to win elections as the objective kinds of indicators fall away and opinions are less sensitive to those.
This answer kind of pushes things back just one president, right? And I mean, one way of when I look at that graph, which is both very elegantly constructed and very, very compelling, of the relationship between consumer sentiment and job approval, and you see the line is flat for Trump, but it was flat for Obama as well. So let's imagine there are three explanations I can think of off the top of my head, right? One is simply that there's so much polarization going on that voters are not translating kind of objective or subjective conditions, but the exogenous evaluations of something like the economy into job approval. The second is that they're so polarized that those sentiments actually just reflect their polarization, right, and their partisanship, and that people are less responsive to kind of objective economic conditions. But if you're a Republican, you think things are going badly under Obama, and if you're a Democrat, the opposite. And then the reverse of those once they're in office. And then the third thing is just that people sort of don't think the presidents are responsible anymore for the economy. So they just simply don't credit a president when things are going well, and they don't fault her eventually when things are going badly. Do you have a sense of, I mean, does this matter, these distinctions? And do you have a sense of which one it is? It seems to me that something happened when Obama was elected, and that really seems to have broken that link, and it's continued through to Trump. And it's a great question as to whether it'll continue through to Biden.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think know that the third possibility has really taken place. So we don't really know that people have decided that presidents aren't really responsible for economic conditions. In fact, if they did think that, that actually might be probably a positive development in some ways, because we give historically the objection, the philosophical objection to the fact that presidential approval and electional outcomes appear responsive to the economy is that in some sense we're giving the president far too much credit and blame for changes in the business cycle that are largely outside of their control. I don't know that we have any evidence that the public's really shifted its view of things. I think of more as the public is increasingly locked in to a view of a president that flows from their partisanship. And I don't know whether, I think on balance, I think that probably is a net detriment in the sense that some forms of democratic accountability will be muted in that scenario. Even if the president doesn't control the economy, there are circumstances where presidents do make affirmative decisions. They make decisions about whether to go to war or not, and that can go badly or well. They make decisions, as Trump has with regard to the pandemic, that I think you can make a plausible case that had he made different and better decisions, the course of the pandemic would be different. So when we don't have that kind of accountability, I think that creates risks, because it insulates presidents to some extent from public control or from the will of at least some voters. But I also want to make a cautionary point though about just any trend that's based on two presidents, right? That's based on Obama and Trump. One of the things that we didn't have in either the Obama presidency or the Trump presidency was a garden variety recession of the kind that we've seen periodically throughout American history. we didn't see a terrorist attack like the 9/11 attacks, which, created this massive upsurge in popularity for George W. Bush. We didn't see a long and punishing war, which may have contributed to a decline in support for George W. Bush. So I want to make clear that I think the challenge of generalizing from those two presidencies is we don't really yet know whether events that are more similar to events in the past would have any different effects. It would take another couple presidencies and some other kinds of variation in objective conditions before we could say for sure that the presidents really are more insulated politically from those conditions.
Yeah, there's something interesting, right? Which is the point that we don't really, the recessions that were experienced by Obama and by Trump are not garden variety recessions, but politicians don't really experience recessions anymore. Is the other part of it, right? That an 8-year president from 1960, between 1960 and like 1992 or 2000, a 2-term president would on average experience 2 to 3 recessions over their term. The cycles were really constrained, right? And now you've got situations where in Australia they didn't have a recession for 30 years. We didn't have a serious one in Canada for almost 20 years. So it just takes a long time for these things to now come around. And I don't think that our politics are tuned up to them. I have a question here from Donna Dasco, John. The question is, do campaigns matter at all? And if so, how? And before you answer it, I'll just let you know, I'll give you a little tip here that Donna is both a 30-year pollster, one of the better ones in Canada, and is also an unelected senator. So she sits in office without a campaign. And she knows a lot about public opinion. But this is something you've written a lot about, particularly in your book. So, there's all this noise, all this fury, all this campaigning, and then the elections always end up within 5 points of each other. Do the campaigns matter at all?
Yeah, I think so. And in some sense, of course, we always answer this question by thinking about presidential general elections, where the effects are probably the smallest that we're going to observe in American politics. Because the presidential candidates are so better known and things like partisanship matter. But even in the presidential election, I would say, first of all, if you go back and you look at the polling averages, Biden's lead over Trump in January or so, when they were pitted to get, in like a head-to-head matchup, if Biden's the nominee and he's running against Trump, what would you do? Biden's lead was about 4 points, which is what, people at that time thought of as a little close for comfort. Over the course of the election year, Biden's lead over Trump expands to about 8 points, large enough that when the polls are off, as they were off in 2020, he still ends up winning the election. And at the same time, people's perceptions of Biden as an individual, how favorably they feel about him, also increased over time. So I think that's evidence of a campaign making a difference and probably making a large enough difference at the margins. I've done similar research on campaign advertising on television. And in a recent paper with a couple of other political scientists, Lynn Vavreck and Chris Warshaw, we showed that at the presidential level, and especially in lower level elections, an advantage in the number of television advertisements that you can run in the 2 months or so before the election absolutely translates into some additional vote share at the margins. And in fact, one of the things I'm very curious about is when we look more closely at the 2020 results, and you think about how narrow Biden's majority is in states like Wisconsin or Georgia, and you go and you look at what was Biden's advertising level and what was Trump's advertising level, in most of these battleground states, with possibly the exception of Georgia, Biden was out advertising Trump by a significant margin. And, I think given what we know about the average effect of those ads on presidential races, it may be the case that aggregates up in terms of the number of votes won to something that is, not much different than, maybe even larger than the actual margin that Biden won by. So to me, I think that, campaigns matter. They do matter. The fact that fundamentals predict elections doesn't mean that a campaign does nothing or does nothing consequential. It is the case, especially if we can for a moment forget about presidential elections, and look down the ballot. And there's where you'll see, I think, more evidence that makes a difference.
Let's dive just a bit more deeply into polling. And I think what's happened in this election, among many other things, is that by the time all the votes are counted, it will look much closer to what the pollsters and the aggregators of pollsters predicted than it did on election night. And election night was a pretty tough night to be an aggregator, especially because those guys were taking a lot a lot of slack. But at the same time that there's all this work in polling, there is this kind of parallel of work that gets done in social science on kind of forecasting or predicting elections from fundamentals. And you've given us some piece of that. There's some picture of that today. And for the most part, forecasting models are pretty good at predicting where elections are going to end up. Can you just I don't know if I have a question here, but can you walk us through what the differences are to those approaches? And just because you live in both of these worlds, kind of talk us through why the polling world hasn't picked up on the usefulness of these models and the accuracy of these models that forecast elections months before.
Yeah, I think I would say that the part of why these simple forecasting models like the two I presented are interesting or even useful is that they're basically testing theories of how voters make decisions, and in particular with something like the economy or presidential approval, you're basically saying, oh, voters are voting in part based on their retrospective assessments of how things have been going under the incumbent president. They could be voting on lots of other things. They could be voting on the character of the challenger or the running mates or the color of people's ties or whatever ads they saw yesterday. But I think there's a theoretical basis to do these things. It's not just like an exercise purely in forecasting, and it's not just a sort of we're not just trying to be cute, and with simplifying models like these. What the advantage of polling to me has always been that it's going to capture the factors that the models aren't capturing. It's going to capture these election-specific forces that are difficult to find historical precedents for. So that's why I think for many people it was very plausible, and for me it was plausible that the polls would show Biden winning by a larger margin than he won by because of the pandemic, right? Surely there's some punishment, or you could construct, surely like voters are just more generally so tired of Trump and the Democrats are so mobilized to oppose him that it would make sense that they could win by a larger fraction. No, maybe that didn't turn out to be true in this election, but nevertheless, I think it's entirely plausible that the polls can capture something. What the forecasting models that you see publicly, like at 538, are doing is they're using both things. They're taking a fundamentals-based forecast, and then they're adding polling to it. Over the course of the campaign, the relative balance of those two things shifts so that the closer you get to elections, the more the forecast relies on the polls. Because the closer you get to elections, the more accurate polling typically gets. So it's a very reasonable decision to make. So when I say if the fundamentals ended up being more right than the polls, I wouldn't say that's like an iron law that will be true, in every election cycle. So it's a very plausible thing for both 538 or The Economist, to do a model that combines both elements. The big challenge for the forecasting community, this was a struggle and a debate in 2016, and I think it emerged again in 2020, is how to translate a forecast like, I think Trump will win 48% of the vote, to a number that says, what chance does Trump have of winning? Does 48, if you think it's 48% of the vote, and there's going to be some uncertainty or some error in that forecast, because no forecast is perfect, how much uncertainty is there? How much error is there? Should 48% equal a 10% chance of winning or 25% chance of winning? And the two major forecasters this year, which 538 and The Economist, they didn't agree on that question initially. Their forecast got more similar over time, but initially The Economist forecast was more confident than 538's forecast was. And I will say, I think everybody that does this work seriously thinks very hard about this question about how to factor in uncertainty, and how to communicate uncertainty to not give people a false sense of what's going to happen. So that you have forecasts in 2016 that gave Trump a 2% chance of winning or a 3% chance of winning, and then he wins. You don't want people to be affected by that in a way that changes their behavior in the election. But even though people are thinking hard about it, it's still a very difficult question to answer. There's no off-the-shelf formula that you can use. And as a result, I think for the average consumer, it can be challenging to think coherently about what a 10 or 12% chance of winning really means, despite the best efforts of people to communicate about that. So I think going forward, the challenges are clearly people would like the polls to be more accurate, and that's one conversation. And then the other conversation will be when people construct these forecasting models, is communicating a percent chance of winning a useful thing? And if you're going to communicate that, how are you calculating that? And is that calculation a defensible calculation?
One thing we've observed, John, we kind of look across the world, look across Canada, is that parties that have run during the pandemic, or candidates or leaders who have run during the pandemic, have actually done pretty well.
Yep.
We've had 3 provincial elections in Canada during COVID. In every case, the incumbent's been returned with a greater vote share, a greater seat share. Of course, Jacinda Ardern, who might be the best politician in the world right now, she won an outright majority in a PR system in New Zealand. So, the pandemic hasn't been bad for politicians. It was probably bad for President Trump. There's a question here from Gary Freeman. I don't know if it's the Gary Freeman who's your old colleague, but it's Gary Freeman asks, though the pandemic may not have been a factor for Trump in this election, can you speculate about the outcome if he had shown the leadership in handling the pandemic since January that the doctors and scientists had been calling for? Yeah. There's this counterfactual that he stands up in March and he says, put on a mask, stay home, we're going to get through this together. What happens then? I mean, this is crystal ball stuff, but was this winnable for him? So
it's a great question. And, I've been working on a big election year polling project, and now perhaps an election book with Lynn Vavreck, whom I mentioned before, and also Chris Stasanovich, who they're both political scientists at UCLA. And one of the things that we've talked about is that if you want to think about the pandemic as, and it's sort of implications for Trump, clearly it didn't hurt him. But I think, as my colleague Chris would say, it was a missed opportunity. The experience of many of these world leaders was that you got a bump in popularity, in some cases, one that's been pretty persistent. It's not just a temporary thing. Not everybody, to be clear. I mean, Boris Johnson, I think his popularity bump was more temporary, but I think Emmanuel Macron's, it's been more durable. Merkel's has been more durable. Then you can look, and of course, Arjun, like you mentioned, but you can also look at some of the American governors who took this more seriously and worked harder. And people's approval of their handling of COVID was much higher than Trump's. And it hasn't, in many cases, hasn't decreased. And you can also find cases where the governor didn't take it very seriously and they didn't experience a bump in approval, or even they experienced a drop in approval, and that would be like Doug Ducey in Arizona. So, I mean, the counterfactual here would be these other leaders. And I think with some caveats, I think the average effect that you would have expected from like a pretty run-of-the-mill, let's follow the science type response to the pandemic is an increase in your approval. And Trump got that very slightly. And he got it in March, and he got it at a period of time where he changed his tone. And he said, this is bad. It's a national, he declares a national emergency. He acts more seriously. And of course, this occasions a lot of news coverage of, Trump, he's changed his tone. And then like 3 weeks later, he was back to, denying the severity and reality of the pandemic, and that's only continued time. So a really interesting question is, could a better pandemic response have helped Trump's approval? I think it's entirely possible. This is one of those cases where, there's an old phrase, good policy is good politics. And I think that's a hard one for politicians to learn sometimes, because they assume that like, the best politics is like denying the problem, obscuring the problem, and as opposed to sort of grappling with it head on. It's better to try to like change whether the CDC, change how the CDC counts these things, or try to take over the data collection and counting process for COVID infections and deaths from the CDC, right? Like that's the kind of stuff they've done, when you might have just let the public health professionals do their work. They're not going to do it perfectly, right? It's not going to be smooth sailing, because our learning curve about this virus, like all viruses, is going to be steep. But nevertheless, I do think that it could have plausibly helped him. And this is where a lot about Trump seems pretty baked in to who he is as a person and as a leader. He didn't appear, I mean, a lot of the American presidency literature is about how presidents learn and change in office, because how can you know what the presidency is like until you inhabit it? And there's a host of presidents who have faltered early Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and then succeeded at least temporarily in righting the ship. And for Clinton, they succeeded over even a longer term. But for Trump, you don't really see that same learning, and you don't really see him able to shift his style and message to one that would probably make his pandemic response a more politically advantageous response.
Yeah, it's like some grow into the office and others make the office as small as they are, right? And that's
yeah. I mean, I think that's been that. I mean, again, and I really do feel like his entire political career, that's kind of how he is. I mean, his business career, it's how he is. He's not really changed a great deal.
I have three quick questions for you in the time we've got remaining. What is and let's shift to a Biden presidency. This is such a curious case, right? This is someone who's been on the American federal scene for more than 40 years. Two really very lackluster presidential campaigns, and he falters in both. Gets in the vice presidency, and then looks like he's going to lose the nomination this time, and wins South Carolina, and the party coalesces around him, and suddenly he's the nominee and he wins. And probably performed better than at least some of us would have expected during the general. What's you're a longtime watcher of this and a longtime watcher of presidencies. What's your sense of what the first years of a Biden presidency look like with and without a Republican majority in the Senate? And what does it look like for his party as they kind of struggle through having someone in the Oval Office having to make compromises?
Yeah, I think Biden is gonna have a tough time. I mean, just because the Democrats' majority in the House is now so narrow, and as you noted, the best case scenario is they have 50 seats in the Senate, and Kamala Harris is the tie-breaking vote. With those kinds of margins, there's just every bit of the ambitious policy agenda that they had, including like ambitious political reform agendas, like maybe we eliminate the filibuster, maybe we expand the size of the Senate by making Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia states. All of those kinds of things are going to be just, I think pretty much off the table. So to me, Biden has always been fairly optimistic, maybe even romantic about the potential of American institutions to function, and the potential for his experiences, his long experience in government, to bear fruit. There's no question that he walks in the door with a somewhat more functional relationship with Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and if McConnell continues to be the Majority Leader. They leveraged Biden to that extent during the Obama administration. He was sometimes the best person, the best envoy to Senate Republicans. But at the same time, Senate Republicans have already signaled in a variety of ways that they're not necessarily going to be on board with the ambitious agenda that the Biden administration might have, even with responding to the pandemic, which is just, one kind of immediate, emergency. It's not clear that Biden's going to get the stimulus that he would like if it's not done in the lame duck. So, yeah, I think the structural conditions in American politics right now, narrow majorities, high degree of polarization between Democrats and Republicans in Congress, just makes it really challenging. The most effective times in recent American history have been in periods of united government with relatively large majorities, like Obama had in 2008, 2009, or excuse me, 2009, 2010. So yeah, I'd say it's a challenge. And it'll really be a case where we get a test of whether these long-standing experiences and relationships, including cross-party relationships, can really bear fruit and make a difference at the margins, or whether we're basically kind of locked into opposing party teams, and it's difficult for anyone to bridge that, even in extraordinary circumstances like the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a remarkable change from an outsider to an insider, right? And one of the more stark ones we've probably seen. What do you see for the Republican Party? They'll be operating under the shadow of Trump or in his continued presence, depending on what he says he's going to do for 2024. What do you see for that party in the next couple of years?
Well, so I would say that when I had a conversation with a Republican a prominent Republican speechwriter and columnist who became a never Trump guy. And I asked him, what would lead the Republican Party to finally change its mind about Trump or to repudiate Trump? And he said, losing. And I think the problem is that 2020 is not the unequivocal losing experience that would have led to that change. Yeah, losing the presidency is a big deal for all the reasons I said earlier. But when you gain seats in the House, and when you're able to hang on to a Senate majority, when you thought there might be half a dozen seats, under threat, and instead the Democrats gained 2. I think there are already Republicans who have said, basically, yeah, this just validates our thinking, validates our approach. So I don't know that they're in a posture of a lot of like learning and recriminations and self examination. That's just a start. And then on the bigger question about what Trump looks like, or what the party looks like in terms of Trump, I mean, to me, I'm a pretty cautious. I would make a very confident prediction, in part because in part because the emergence of Trump in 2016 was such a surprise relative to what the direction the party seemed to want to go after they lost in 2012. So, the lessons in the few months after an election oftentimes don't age very well, and unexpected things happen in 4 years. And I don't quite know where that would leave the party. If I were to point out any lasting impact of Trump, I mean, I think that if there's a lasting impact, it's on the issues where Trump wasn't already pretty much in line with the average Republican. Trump got in line on a bunch of issues. People underestimate Trump's how much Trump changed the party, because I think the party changed Trump more. But I think on trade, he's clearly, I think, staked out a position that's going to make it harder for the party to be a more unequivocally free trade party. But also on immigration, I feel like he's staked out a position that was shared by a faction of the party, but it was just a faction. And now I think that faction has become more dominant, or at least the moderates on immigration have become silent. And I don't know whether that's going to be changed relatively easily. I do think that most of the rest of Trump, the personal stuff, his behavior, his rhetoric, I don't know if that has a long shelf life in the party. I think a lot of that is just Trump, and a lot of other politicians just don't act that way because that's not who they are. So I do think long term, we might wonder whether a Trump presidency has made like immigration reform a harder sell in the party, or has made free trade agreements a harder sell in the party. But on many, many other questions, without the repudiation of a Biden landslide, I don't know how much the party is going to really interrogate its own views. And at least to sit here in American politics right now, you feel like almost like there's more recrimination on the Democratic side than on the Republican side, precisely because their expectations were so disappointed, on election night.
John, I have one final question for you. How many of the Senate races will be won by the Republicans and by the Democrats in Georgia?
I think they're two toss-ups. Is the way I would think about it. So I don't think you can make any firm predictions. This historic trend when Georgia has these runoff elections has been, of course, for a decline in turnout, and typically that decline disproportionately hurts the Democratic candidate. That's been the historical pattern. But that's not really that many races, and it's over a long period of time. And these runoffs are likely to be really quite different. One of my friends texted me a couple of days after the election and said, how much money is going to be spent on the runoff in Georgia? Take the over under on 250 billion. And I was like, million, excuse me. And I was like, no, give me the over under on 500 million. Like $500 million we could see in these races in the next 2 months, given that like we saw almost a couple $100 million spent in a couple of Senate races this year. So, I mean, it will be contested at such a level that I don't know how much these historical precedents will hold. What I would say is this: at the end of the day, on election night, Georgia was almost 50-50 on the presidential race. I see no reason to think that it's going to be substantially different than that on the runoff. which means it could tip in either direction, depending on a host of things. So for that reason, I think it is, neither party can really have a great deal of confidence going in. And, if you live in Atlanta, you're going to see a lot of television ads.
Yeah, there's a lot hanging in the balance. John, thanks very, very much for joining us. You've given us an hour of your time, and it's really clarified a lot of things, both about how we should think about the relationship between fundamentals and election outcomes, helps us understand the 2020 election, and it's given, I think, some good insights into what's coming down the pike. So we really, really appreciate, as always, you're joining us, and look forward to doing it again soon, hopefully next time in person.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, John.